Mackenzie Shirilla, the subject of the new Netflix documentary The Crash, is not guilty of murder.
Do I think she should be in prison for murder? No. I'm a forensic scientist and a former CSI. I have investigated crashes, including fatal crashes, pretty similar to the one that Mackenzie Shirilla caused.
And I watched that crash documentary, and all of the commentary that I've seen about it has been so different than how I think things probably went down. Like, I just keep seeing all of these comments about like how terrible the parents were and how awful she is, and so she's guilty. And like, yes, awful parents. And Mackenzie is an annoying person and likely an awful person, but that doesn't equal schmurder.
The Mackenzie Shirilla documentary has sparked a lot of attention and a lot of conversation all over the internet. One of the more unpopular conversations is that Mackenzie isn't guilty of murder. And I'm not talking about from her fans. I'm talking about from professionals who see cases like this on a regular basis.
Mackenzie Shirilla, the subject of the new Netflix documentary The Crash, is not guilty of murder. Guilty of manslaughter, but not guilty of murder. And
meet Stephanie. She's a defense attorney out of New York, and she believes that Mackenzie's attorney made a critical error by going with a bench trial instead of a jury.
If you don't know who I am, my name is Stephanie. I'm a criminal defense attorney, specifically a public defender, and I, like many of you, have recently been paying more attention to this case since the new Netflix documentary dropped. Now, let me explain to you my opinion. In order for her to be guilty of murder, there has to be that premeditation and that intent, right? And I think that that's where the prosecution failed in their case. Now, obviously, the judge disagreed. She opted for a bench trial. And the reason why they opted for a bench trial is because the case focused so much on that premeditation and that intent, which is more of a legal issue than that, which would have been a little bit more complicated for a jury. So her defense team felt that a judge would be better able to understand that premeditation and intent part of the murder charges. But I think the prosecution failed to show that. Really, they had only that she had visited or driven past where the accident happened 3 days prior. That was really their nail in the coffin moment for them. But I don't think that necessarily shows premeditation, because there could be a multitude of reasons why she had driven past that location or had visited that location prior. What those could have been is up to her, but she doesn't have to say anything in her own defense, right? The other arguments were that she and her boyfriend had broken up multiple times. That would be Dom, that they had a contentious relationship, that she was abusive towards him. But still, none of that leads me to the ultimate conclusion of, did she intentionally want to kill them? Her foot was still pressed on the gas when they arrived at the scene, which to me, it just doesn't scream intentional or premeditated.
Stephanie goes on to say that people have a difficult time acknowledging that Mackenzie may not be guilty of murder because of the emotions involved in the case.
Here is why some of you cannot wrap your head around the fact that Mackenzie Shirilla may not be guilty of murder, but is guilty of manslaughter. Okay? Emotion. The law has nothing to do with emotion. Sometimes an accident is just an accident. Now, you can go back and watch my other video on this. You guys have a lot to say about it. She's guilty of murder. She premeditated it. There's obvious. She was there a few days earlier. She did a dry run. The prosecutors actually never proved that she did a dry run. They proved that she was there 3 days prior, and they couldn't fathom a reason as to why she was there. And you ask, well, why didn't she have to give a reason that she was there? She's not required to speak, guys. She's not required to say anything. Her defense team can stand mute the entire time. They cannot question a single witness if they don't want to. It's not on her to prove her innocence. It's on them to prove that she's guilty. Now, they did. They proved her guilty of murder, intentional, premeditated murder. Okay? Do I think that that's the right verdict? No, I do not. Okay, I've watched all 3 of the documentaries that are out on our available for us available. I also watched this case from the beginning when it was being litigated, and I was surprised by the verdict. Do I think she's guilty of manslaughter? Yes. Do I think she's guilty of murder? No. And the reason why people can't wrap their head around the difference between those two is because you are letting your emotions come into play, because it is very sad that 2 young men lost their lives. It's very sad. It's awful. It's horrific. I feel horrible for those families, but that doesn't mean that your emotions supersede what the law is. Her downfall here was doing a bench trial. Now, the reason she did a bench trial was because the nuance in the law is difficult for a jury to understand. They assumed wrongly that a judge would be able to take the emotion out of it. The judge did not. If you watched his rulings during the trial, if you watched how he was during the victim impact statements, if you watched how he was during the mitigation, he very clearly could not take the emotion out of it. You saw that when he was scolding her mother when she was speaking. Okay? There was emotion attached to every decision that the judge made. And that is the problem. The law has nothing to do with emotion. And when you can remove that, then you can very clearly see that there are issues with this case. And there are issues with the fact that she was convicted of murder. Now, you can agree or disagree with me, but I do this for a living. This is my job.
And several other attorneys agree with Stephanie. As a lawyer, I agree with you. It was glaringly obvious as I watched. I'm a lawyer and a former prosecutor. This case is egregious. They did not prove intent, not in the slightest. Her defense was so bad, she absolutely deserves an appeal for ineffective assistance of counsel. And attorneys are not the only profession that thinks that Mackenzie is innocent of murder.
Do I think she should be in prison for murder? No. I'm a forensic scientist and a former CSI. I have investigated crashes, including fatal crashes, pretty similar to the one that Mackenzie Shirilla caused. And I have watched the crash documentary, which came out on Netflix last week. Having said that, do I believe that she should be in prison? Yes. I do not think that she committed murder.
Meet Amy. She's a forensic scientist and former CSI, and she doesn't believe that the evidence in this case proves intent.
So Mackenzie was driving this car, which as you can see is very, very damaged, because it hit a brick wall going 100+ miles per hour. And obviously when a very fast object runs into an immovable object, you're going to have a big problem. The building that she hit was this building here, and she was traveling down Progress Drive. And there's a stop sign here at this intersection. So you're supposed to be going about 35 miles an hour, stop, and then turn right or turn left. What she did was travel 100 miles per hour. She did not stop until she hit the building, and then she was forced to stop. I have worked a couple of crashes like this in the past, and the ones that come to mind were a very similar intersection, a T-shaped intersection, and instead of there being a building here, there was a house. And in the case that I'm thinking of, the people were traveling down the road at night. It was dark, very similar to what happened with Mackenzie. There's no street lights out here. There's just a stop sign. And my people were going very fast, probably approaching 100 miles per hour. They were under the influence of alcohol. She was under the influence of THC. And they went through the intersection because they did not realize that they were running out of road. And then they basically hit the edge of the house, went airborne, and catapulted way far away down a hill, landed upside down, and both people in the car died. Now, going 100 miles per hour down that road is obviously not okay. It's 3 times the speed limit. Driving under the influence of marijuana is also not okay. It's illegal for a reason. It's going to impair your judgment. But when you combine that she was under the influence of THC, and it was dark, and she is a teenager who even now seems very emotionally immature and irresponsible, I think it is reasonable to assume that she would just be being a little shithead, driving 100 miles an hour down that road and not realize that she was running out of road and then hit the edge of the building. I do not think that there is sufficient evidence to prove intent. What she did is certainly criminally negligent. I think it is more appropriately manslaughter and not murder. And I think that if she had a better attorney would have advised her to go for a jury trial and try to get this down to manslaughter. I'm going to guess, after watching the documentary and seeing how Mackenzie behaved and seeing how her parents behaved, that they probably went into this with the mistaken idea that Mackenzie should not do any time in prison and that they could go in front of a judge and get a bench trial and get a not guilty verdict. If they went in front of a jury, she would have been convicted of something. I think she would have more likely been convicted of manslaughter and not murder, because I think it would have been really hard, given the facts in this case, to prove to 12 people that she intended to kill the 2 passengers in her car, especially since she herself was gravely injured. which means she would have had to have the intent to kill herself as well. And I'm not sure that there was really any evidence submitted to show that she had a history of suicidal ideation.
But one of the most damning pieces of evidence is a practice run that Mackenzie went on days before the accident. Here's what Amy had to say about it.
But I've got a lot of comments about this practice run or this dry run and how her driving the route in advance is proof that she committed murder and that she intended to kill people. Now, all of you guys are like a prosecutor's dream because you are all willing to accept the evidence as presented in the light most favorable to the prosecution. But I think it's really important to consider both sides of this case. I don't disagree with the fact that there is evidence that Mackenzie Shirilla drove this road, drove Progress Drive in the past. However, the characterization of that past driving on this road as a dry run or a practice run for murder is just made up. Calling it a dry run is assigning intent to her past driving down this road when you don't have any evidence of that intent. She could have just been driving around for the hell of it. Even if she had no reason to be driving in this area, it's not illegal or inherently suspicious for somebody to drive on a roadway that is publicly accessible. Especially considering that she was a teenager, it was summer, she didn't really have any responsibilities and nobody was really monitoring what she was doing. And lots of the time, teenagers just kind of drive around and cruise. So it's entirely possible that she could have driven on this road in the past just for the hell of it. There's no proof, and there's not even really any evidence to imply that her previous trips down this road were a dry run. And also, the fact that she's driven down this road once or twice or a couple of times before does not mean that she has mentally mapped it out and that she knows where the stop sign and where the building is. I think it is totally unreasonable to believe, unless this was a road that she drove down every single day, which it wasn't, that she would have it kind of committed to memory and know where the hazards were.
And a lot of people believe that the fact that Mackenzie Shirilla did not apply the brake is proof that she intended to commit murder. And I'm sorry, that's just not true, and I will explain why. Mackenzie Shirilla was driving down Progress Drive before she hit this building, and she was driving at about 100 miles per hour. A car traveling at 100 miles per hour is going to cover about 147 feet every second. Now, look at where the accident took place. In between the intersection of Progress Drive and the side of the building is 178 feet. And remember, this collision happened at about 5:30 in the morning, and you can see in the traffic camera video that it's still pretty dark outside. Now, it's a pretty straight road, and so she's driving 100 miles per hour down a straightaway, and by the time she gets to the intersection, she only has about another second of driving time before she hits the building. So why wouldn't she apply the brakes in that 1 second? Well, because humans have to process information and there is a reaction time. So from the time that you see a threat until the time that your mind perceives and is able to react, it's about a quarter of a second. Some people are able to see and react to stimulus in that quarter of a second time, and some people are not. And certainly, if you are under the influence of something like marijuana that's going to slow your reaction rate, that is going to be a problem. If you are sleep deprived, as we know Mackenzie Shirilla was because she'd only slept for a couple of hours at her friend's house, and this is 5:30 in the morning, that's also going to slow your reaction and your decision time. It is totally unreasonable to believe then in the approximate 1 second that she had between the time that she left the relative safety of the roadway and hit into the side of the building that she had sufficient time to react and apply the brake. So then let's just talk about the relative speed. Isn't the fact that she's driving 100 miles per hour proof of intent in and of itself? No. In fact, in a recent national survey of drivers, about 11% of American drivers admitted that they had driven over 100 miles per hour at some point in time. Certainly not all of those people are homicidal. And in Ohio, where this took place, the Ohio State Highway Patrol or the Ohio State Troopers have written 80% more tickets post-pandemic than pre-pandemic for drivers going over 100 miles per hour. In the county where I live and work, our police wrote about 100 tickets for drivers going over 100 miles per hour in the year 2023, which is the last year that statistics were available for it. So people drive very, very fast. They're not homicidal, they're reckless. It's criminal, absolutely. It's not evidence of intent. And at that rate of speed, it is unreasonable to believe that an average driver would be able to brake and steer away from a threat in a sufficient amount of time to avoid a collision. That's the literal reason why we have these speed limits, because it's not safe to be driving that fast. None of that, however, is proof of intent. It is all proof of reckless driving, which she is absolutely guilty of.
But what about Mackenzie's parents and all those videos and testimony of Mackenzie being a mean girl?
I watched that crash documentary, and all of the commentary that I've seen about it has been so different than how I think things probably went down. Like, I just keep seeing all of these comments about like how terrible the parents were and how awful she is, and so she's guilty. And like, yes, awful parents. And Mackenzie is an annoying person and likely an awful person. But that doesn't equal schmurder.
Meet Lauren. She goes by Your Trauma Therapist on social media, and she doesn't believe that the Shirillas' questionable parenting or Mackenzie's mean girl persona necessarily add up to murder.
And the thing that I get stuck on, and I think as a therapist that has worked with teen girls that remind me a lot of Mackenzie, is that like they are explosive and impulsive, and their prefrontal cortex is not developed to the point where they can rein that in very well. And then you add THC on top of it, which further, slows that process down. And also this happened at, I think, 6 a.m. and a tumultuous relationship. Like, that is just like gasoline on the fire of a 17-year-old girl's emotional regulation. And so what I think happened is that she was probably fighting with a boyfriend, or they were getting into it or whatever, and she got explosive and she just like freaked out and hit the gas, and it was really unfortunate because I just can't wrap my head around the alternative of doing it on purpose, like running. Like, the fact that she survived that is wild. And so unless she wanted to not survive that, which I also don't think is the case, like the amount of like expertise and skill you would have to choose that as your premeditated plan to end somebody's life it's not feasible to me. I think what is so feasible from working with this population is just lack of forethought, explosive behavior, poor emotional regulation, and like things that are like fights are huge, like smaller issues are giant. And so that's what I think happened. And again, I don't think she's a good person. I think her parents are awful. I think her parents probably enabled her behavior. But again, I don't think that equals schmurder. And I really tend to think that if they had a jury trial, it would be really, really hard to find that she's guilty of this beyond a reasonable doubt.
So we have 3 different opinions from 3 different professionals who all believe that Mackenzie should be innocent of murder. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.